The smell of rotting flesh and rancid spices filled the air of the royal chamber when the court physicians finally dared to open the body of the man who once ruled France with an iron fist. It was August 1589, and Henry III had been dead for 3 days, his face still contorted in an expression of agony that no embalmer had managed to erase completely. The candles flickered against the damp stone walls of Saint-Cloud Castle, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the royal corpse. Dr. John Riolan, the chief physician, hesitated with the scalpel in his trembling hands, knowing that this autopsy would reveal secrets capable of shaking the very foundations of the French monarchy. Henry of Valois had ascended the throne in 1574 as a 22-year-old youth, as handsome as a Greek god, refined like a Renaissance prince, and as cruel as a Roman emperor. His coronation at Reims had been a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence. Persian carpets covered the floor of the cathedral, incense rose in golden clouds toward the Gothic vaults, and his diamond-encrusted crown captured the light of 1,000 candles as if it were made of trapped stars. The young king wore Venetian silks dyed with Tyrian purple, his aristocratic hands adorned with rings worth more than entire castles. His smile was magnetic, his blue eyes hypnotized courtiers and ambassadors, and his melodious voice echoed through the halls of the Louvre like celestial music. He was the epitome of French royalty, heir to a lineage stretching back to Charlemagne, lord of a kingdom that extended from the Pyrenees to the Rhine. The early years of his reign were marked by opulence bordering on delirium. Henry had transformed the French court into a perpetual theater of lust and extravagance, where every meal was a banquet worthy of Roman Caesars. The royal tables bowed under the weight of whole roasted boars, swans stuffed with Indian spices, Burgundian wine served in solid gold goblets, and confections molded into obscene shapes that made the ladies of the court blush and giggle behind their ivory fans. The king ate with an almost animal voracity, chewing loudly while his mignons, his young favorites, who surrounded him like a pack of trained hounds, competed for his attention with poisonous whispers and calculated caresses. The banquets stretched on for hours, becoming gastronomic orgies where gluttony mixed with other cardinal sins in a macabre dance of aristocratic decadence. But there was something disturbing about the way Henry related to food. Contemporary witnesses, such as the chronicler Peter de l'Estoile, recorded with growing discomfort the monarch's eccentric dietary habits. The king had developed a morbid obsession with extreme flavors. He sent for the rarest spices from the East, paying fortunes for peppers that burned the tongue like iron forged in flame, and for herbs with hallucinogenic properties sold by Arab merchants in small vials sealed with red wax. During dinners, Henry mixed incompatible ingredients with a morbid curiosity more reminiscent of a deranged alchemist than a refined gourmet. He combined honey with strong vinegar, venison with rotten fruits, sweet wine with sea salt, creating nauseating mixtures that he made a point of tasting before the horrified court. His private physicians whispered among themselves about the possibility that the king was trying to poison himself slowly in an elaborate form of royal suicide. France's political situation mirrored the deteriorating mental state of its sovereign. The wars of religion had turned the kingdom into a perpetual slaughterhouse between Catholics and Huguenots, and Henry found himself caught between factions that hated him with equal intensity. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, that sinister Italian with coal black eyes and a viper's smile, constantly whispered Machiavellian advice in his ear, stoking his paranoia. The night of the St. Bartholomew's massacre in 1572 still haunted his dreams. Thousands of Protestants slaughtered in the streets of Paris, the Seine running red, screams of agony echoing through medieval alleys while he, then still Duke of Anjou, watched from his palace window with a goblet of wine in hand and a cold smile on his lips. That carnage had stained his soul irreversibly, planting in him a thirst for blood that grew like a spiritual cancer. As the years passed, Henry III's eating habits became increasingly bizarre and disturbing. He began demanding that his meals be prepared in secret, away from the servants' eyes, by a sinister-looking Italian cook named Matteo Barberini, who had arrived at the French court with a group of Florentine artists. Barberini was a gaunt man, his grey hair always slicked with perfumed oils, small rat-like eyes, and long, pale hands that seemed more suited to dissecting corpses than cooking. He worked in the palace kitchens only during the dead of night, when everyone slept, stirring smoking cauldrons while murmuring Latin incantations that sounded like profane spells. The other court cooks avoided him, whispering that his foods had a strange, almost supernatural taste that made those who tried them addicted and gave them terrible nightmares. The dishes Barberini created for the king were true culinary aberrations that defied all logic. He served raw meats marinated in sour wine and poisonous herbs, fish cooked in their own blood mixed with goat urine, fowl stuffed with live worms that writhed when Henry lifted them to his mouth. The king devoured these monstrous delicacies with obscene pleasure, licking his blood-stained fingers as his eyes took on a feverish gleam that made courtiers instinctively recoil. After these macabre meals, Henry frequently suffered violent convulsions, vomiting a dark, viscous substance that reeked of sulfur and rotting organic matter. Yet instead of stopping, he returned the next day to repeat the murderous ritual, as if he were addicted to a lethal drug he could not give up. The king's body began to reflect the rot growing inside him. His skin, once smooth and rosy like a cherub's, had turned yellowed and covered with dark blotches that seemed to shift under the epidermis. His breath exuded a fetid odor, reminiscent of decaying flesh mixed with wilted flowers, so intense that courtiers had to cover their noses with scented handkerchiefs during royal audiences. His golden hair, once silky like strands of pure gold, became dull and brittle, falling out in clumps he found on his pillow every morning. His nails grew abnormally, turning a sickly green and taking on a horn-like texture reminiscent of a predator's claws. When he smiled, his yellowed, cavity-ridden teeth gave him the appearance of a cadaver risen from the grave to haunt the living. The French court, once the epicenter of European elegance and refinement, gradually transformed into a pestilent, oppressive environment. The halls of the Louvre, formerly perfumed with rose and jasmine essences, now reeked of medicines, rancid sweat, and an indefinable smell reminiscent of decomposition. Courtiers whispered in groups, their voices reduced to nervous murmurs that ceased abruptly whenever the king approached. The ladies of the court, formerly radiant in their brocade gowns and sparkling jewels, now appeared as spectral figures, their powdered faces unable to hide the sallow pallor consuming them. The servants themselves avoided serving the king, and many requested transfers to other royal palaces, citing imaginary illnesses or urgent family matters. Those who remained developed a vacant, haunted look, as if they had witnessed things no human being should ever see. The court physicians, initially discreet about their concerns, began writing increasingly alarming reports on the monarch's health. Dr. William Rondebelis, Henry's personal physician, noted in his private diary, later discovered among his papers, that His Majesty exhibits symptoms that defy all my medical training. His stomach emits horrible sounds during digestion, as if something alive were thrashing about inside. His feces have a color and odor I have never encountered. In 30 years of practice, and when I analyze his urine, I find substances I cannot identify, some of which seem to move under the microscope. Another physician, Dr. Ambrose Paré, wrote in confidential correspondence with colleagues in other European courts, I fear our king has fallen victim to some form of slow and systematic poisoning, but the symptoms do not correspond to any known toxin. It is as if something is growing inside him, feeding on his very life force. Henry III's paranoia reached pathological levels when he began to suspect that unseen enemies were poisoning his food. He installed official tasters, desperate men who accepted the risk of their lives for a few gold coins, forcing them to eat every dish before it reached the royal table. Many of these brave souls died in terrible convulsions, vomiting blood and bile as their bodies writhed on the marble floors of the royal halls. Yet even so, Henry continued eating compulsively, as if he could not stop. He ordered a secret chamber built deep beneath the palace where he dined alone, away from curious eyes. In that windowless chamber, lit only by black candles that dripped red wax, the King of France devoured ever more bizarre dishes, while his shadows danced on the walls like demons celebrating a profane Sabbath. During this period of physical and mental deterioration, Henry developed a morbid obsession with recording his culinary experiences in a secret diary, written in code and hidden behind a false wall in his private apartments. This document, discovered decades later by historians, revealed the extent of the madness consuming him. The taste of snake blood mixed with poisoned honey awakens in me sensations that transcend the purely physical. It is as if each drop nourishes not only my body, but something deeper, something ancient that dwells in the shadows of my soul. In another entry dated 3 months before his death, he wrote, "Barberini brought me something special today, that he calls the essence of eternity. It looks like water, but burns like liquid fire as it goes down my throat. After drinking it, I feel as if 1,000 voices whisper in my mind, speaking in languages I do not recognize yet understand perfectly. They tell me secrets about power, about death, about things that lie beyond the veil of mortal reality." Cook Matteo Barberini had become more than a mere court servant. He was now the king's most intimate confidant, his advisor on matters far beyond gastronomy. Witnesses reported seeing them together during the hours before dawn, walking through the castle's dark corridors while they whispered urgent conversations. Barberini always carried a black leather satchel slung over his shoulder, from which strange odors and muffled sounds emanated, as if something alive inside were trying to escape. When curious courtiers asked about the satchel's contents, the Italian replied with a cold smile that never reached his eyes. Special ingredients for His Majesty's refined palate. Some servants swore they saw small, dark creatures escaping from the bag at night, crawling along the walls like enormous insects. But these stories were quickly silenced by the king's express orders. France's political situation continued, deteriorating in parallel with the monarch's health. The Catholic League, led by the ambitious Duke of Guise, gained strength among the French people, who saw in Henry III a weak, debauched and possibly heretical king. Pamphlets circulating secretly through the streets of Paris described him as the crowned Antichrist and the demon devouring France from within. When Henry ordered the assassination of the Duke of Guise in December 1588 during a meeting at Blois Castle, the act was carried out in a particularly sadistic manner that shocked even the brutal standards of the time. Witnesses reported that after the assassin's daggers found their mark, Henry approached Guise's bloodied body and, in a gesture that horrified everyone present, plunged his fingers into the Duke's warm blood and brought them to his mouth. Tasting the crimson liquid as though it were the finest wine, his face contorted in an expression of morbid ecstasy, and he murmured, "Finally, a flavor that satisfies my hunger." That episode marked the beginning of the end for Henry III. News of the assassination and the king's macabre behavior spread through France like wildfire, inciting the population against the monarch. Paris openly revolted, and the king was forced to flee the capital, finding precarious refuge at Saint-Cloud Castle. But even there, surrounded by a dwindling and increasingly distrustful guard, Henry continued his aberrant eating practices. Barberini had managed to follow him into exile, carrying his mysterious leather satchel and his profane recipes. King's meals became even more extreme in their bizarreness. He ate only during the new moon, always alone, always preceded by strange rituals involving circles drawn with salt on the floor and archaic Latin incantations that made the guards cross themselves nervously. In July 1589, a young Dominican friar named James Clement gained an audience with the king, claiming to have important information about a conspiracy against the crown. Clement was an unassuming man, short and thin, with chestnut hair cut in the traditional clerical tonsure and eyes that gleamed with the fanatical fervor of true believers. Yet there was something unsettling about his presence that the royal guards could not define. Perhaps the way his hands trembled constantly, or the acrid scent of sweat and incense emanating from his robes, or the way he muttered prayers under his breath even during ordinary conversation. When he was brought to the royal apartments on the morning of August 1st, Clement carried only a small dagger hidden in the folds of his habit and a determined will forged by months of fasting and flagellation. The encounter between the king and the friar lasted only a few minutes, but changed the course of French history. Witnesses later reported that Henry III seemed strangely lethargic that morning, as if under the influence of some narcotic substance. His movements were slow and uncoordinated, his speech dragged, and his eyes had that glassy look characteristic of someone who had consumed some of Barberini's exotic mixtures. When Clement approached to deliver a supposed letter, the dagger emerged from the folds of his habit, like a serpent attacking its prey. The blade pierced the royal abdomen with a sickening wet sound, and Henry let out a cry, more like the howl of a wounded animal than a human scream. The friar was immediately torn apart by the guards, but the damage had been done. The King of France lay on the marble floor of his apartments, his regal garments quickly stained by a dark red that spread like a wine spill on fine fabric. Henry's agony lasted 3 full days, 3 days that witnesses described as a literal descent into hell. The king thrashed about in his bed, alternating between periods of unconsciousness and terrifying moments of lucidity when he screamed about creatures he saw in the shadows, about voices calling him to accompany them to places no mortal should know. His body was racked by violent convulsions that made the royal bed shake as if an earthquake were rocking it. He vomited constantly a dark, viscous substance that smelled of rotting flesh and unknown chemicals, staining the silk sheets with grotesque patterns reminiscent of demonic hieroglyphs. During his deliriums, he constantly called for Barberini, but the Italian cook had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the assassination, taking his leather satchel and all his macabre culinary instruments with him. When death finally arrived on the early morning of August 2nd, 1589, it brought with it a scene that would be forever etched in the memories of those present. Henry III's body convulsed one last time so violently that it arched off the bed, his eyes bulging until they became almost 2 white spheres, and from his open mouth spewed a black liquid that smoked like acid. The odor that spread through the room was indescribable, a mixture of decomposing flesh, sulfur, rotten flowers, and something vaguely reminiscent of cinnamon, but perverted into a nauseating version of itself. When the body finally relaxed, in death, the expression fixed on his face was neither peaceful nor restful, but one of absolute horror, as if he had glimpsed something in the darkness of death that terrified him to his last conscious moments. It was then that Dr. John Riolan, the court's chief physician, made the decision that would change his life forever. Against all royal protocols and risking his own position at court, he decided to perform a full autopsy on the deceased monarch's body. Officially, the cause of death was obvious: A stab wound to the abdomen had caused fatal internal hemorrhaging. But Riolan had witnessed the king's 3 days of agony, had seen the bizarre symptoms, had smelled the supernatural odors emanating from the royal body, and his medical conscience would not allow him to leave those anomalies uninvestigated. In the dead of night on August 3rd, just 24 hours after the king's death, he gathered 2 assistants of absolute trust, Dr. Peter Morel and the young medical student Anthony Dubois. The 3 of them made their way to the mortuary chamber where the royal body awaited official embalming. The chamber was a dark, oppressive environment, its stone walls sweating sticky moisture and its windows too small to let in adequate natural light. Henry III's corpse lay on a black marble table, covered only by a linen sheet that could not entirely hide the post-mortem deformities that had developed in the hours since death. Even in death, the royal cadaver continued to exude that characteristic odor that had intensified over time, forcing the 3 physicians to cover their noses and mouths with cloths soaked in aromatic vinegar. The candles illuminating the room flickered constantly, as if some supernatural breeze stirred them, casting dancing shadows that gave the royal corpse the macabre illusion of still moving. Dr. Riolan approached the table with the scalpel in hand, but hesitated for a long moment before making the first incision. It was not only respect for royalty that held him back, but also a primitive, instinctive sense that he was about to desecrate something that should remain inviolable. Henry's body seemed to radiate an aura of malignancy that made the hairs on the doctor's arms stand on end and his breathing become labored. When the blade finally touched the yellowed skin of the royal abdomen, the sound was different from what he expected. Instead of the familiar noise of metal slicing flesh, there was a hiss as if air escaped from a container under pressure, followed by an even more intense odor that made Dr. Morel rush to a corner of the room to vomit violently. As the incision deepened, revealing the layers of adipose tissue and muscle, the physicians began to notice anomalies that defied their understanding of human anatomy. The king's body fat had an abnormal greenish hue and a texture more like melted wax than natural organic tissue. His abdominal muscles displayed dark striations that seemed to shift when observed peripherally, as if they were pulsating veins from some unknown organ. But when Dr. Riolan finally reached the abdominal cavity, the true extent of the aberration was revealed in all its horrific glory. Henry III's stomach had transformed into something that did not belong to the realm of normal human anatomy. Swollen to 3 times its normal size, the organ had a dark purple coloration, marbled with black veins, radiating like the tentacles of some sea creature. Its surface was not smooth as it should have been, but covered in irregular protrusions that pulsated rhythmically, as if something alive struggled inside. When Dr. Riolan touched the distended organ with the tip of his scalpel, it contracted violently, producing a gurgling liquid sound that made the doctor instinctively recoil. A dark, viscous substance began to seep through the walls of the stomach, staining the adjacent organs with an oily coloration that smelled simultaneously of Eastern spices and decomposing organic matter. But when he decided to open the stomach, Dr. Riolan made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The interior of the organ did not contain the partially digested remains of a last meal, as would be expected, but something entirely different and deeply disturbing. Floating in a thick, dark fluid resembling clotted blood mixed with bile were dozens of small objects that should not exist in the human digestive system. There were fragments of metal that shone with their own inner light, precious stones of impossible shapes that seemed to contain tiny storms within their crystalline cores. And most horrifying of all, what appeared to be miniature organs, tiny hearts still beating faintly, microscopic lungs inflating and deflating, and eyes the size of pearls that blinked and moved as if alive and aware. Dr. Morell, having recovered enough to approach the table again, let out a muffled scream when he saw the contents of the royal stomach. Among the impossible objects were also what appeared to be small, rolled parchments, worm-sized, covered in symbols that did not belong to any known alphabet. When Dr. Riolan tried to grasp one of these parchments with forceps, it disintegrated at the touch, releasing a cloud of golden dust that shimmered in the air for a moment before dissipating completely. The odor emanating from the opened stomach was indescribable, a mixture of all the world's most exotic spices combined with the stench of death and something that smelled like metal heated by a thunderstorm. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. At the bottom of the stomach, partially hidden by the viscous fluid, lay something that made even the experienced Dr. Riolan question his own sanity. It was a small creature, no larger than a newborn kitten, but possessing features that belonged to no known species. Its skin was translucent, allowing its internal organs to be seen glowing with their own light. Its limbs were a bizarre blend of paws and tentacles, and its head was disproportionately large, equipped with multiple eyes that reflected the candlelight like precious gems. The creature was clearly dead, but its body showed no signs of the decomposition one would expect. After days in stomach acid, instead, it looked nearly mummified, preserved by a process that defied the natural laws of biology. Anthony Dubois, the young student who had remained in shocked silence throughout the autopsy, finally found his voice to whisper, "My God, what is this thing?" Dr. Riolan had no answer. In 40 years of medical practice, he had seen rare diseases, congenital malformations, bizarre tumors, but never anything that so completely defied his understanding of natural human anatomy. The creature in the king's stomach was neither a known parasite nor a tumor. It was nothing that could be explained by conventional medicine. It was as if Henry III had literally consumed something from another world, something that should not exist in earthly reality. As the three physicians gazed in horror, additional small details began to emerge. The creature had what appeared to be vestigial wings folded against its body, and its translucent skin revealed a circulatory system that glowed with a phosphorescent bluish-green fluid. More disturbing still, there were signs that the creature had been partially consumed. One of its limbs was missing, and there were tiny teeth marks along its torso. Dr. Riolan began to suspect that this was not the first such creature Henry had eaten, but perhaps the last of a series, the only one he had failed to digest completely before his death. The investigation continued with the analysis of the king's other organs. His liver was nearly 4 times its normal size and had a strange texture reminiscent of black crystal. When cut open, it revealed internal cavities filled with a golden liquid glowing like molten metal. The intestines were distended and colored in shades of purple and green, not found in normal human anatomy, and they contained more fragments of the mysterious parchments and impossible gemstones. When the king's heart was finally examined, it showed signs of having worked under extreme stress. Its chambers were dilated and its walls thickened as if it had been pumping something far more viscous than ordinary blood. But it was the brain that revealed the last and most terrifying discovery of the autopsy. When Dr. Riolan carefully removed the top of the royal skull and exposed the organ that had commanded one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, he found a mass barely recognizable as human brain tissue. Henry III's brain had transformed into a semi-transparent, crystalline substance crossed by veins of material that glowed with their own light. Small star-shaped crystals were embedded throughout the mass, pulsating with a rhythmic luminosity, like a beating heart. When touched with metal instruments, the crystallized brain produced soft, musical sounds, as if it were an instrument of glass and light. The most disturbing discovery in the brain was a small chamber that had formed at the center of the crystalline mass, containing what appeared to be a perfect miniature of Henry III himself. The figure, no larger than a pinky finger, was perfectly preserved and detailed, dressed in an exact replica of the royal robes the monarch had worn on the day of his death. Its tiny eyes were open and seemed to follow the doctor's movements around the autopsy table. Dr. Morel later swore he saw the miniature's lips move as if trying to speak, though no sound was produced. The 3 hours the physicians spent examining Henry III's body became an experience that would change their lives forever. Each new discovery took them farther from familiar medical territory and closer to a realm of horrors that defied any rational explanation. Dr. Riolan documented every anomaly meticulously in notes written with shaking hands, but even his carefully chosen words seemed inadequate to describe what they had witnessed. His Majesty's body, he wrote, is no longer human in the conventional sense of the word. It is as if it has become a vessel for forces and substances that do not belong to our mortal world. When they finally concluded the autopsy and began the process of closing the body for official embalming, the 3 physicians made a pact of silence that they kept until their deaths. Officially, Henry III's cause of death was recorded as internal hemorrhaging, resulting from Jacques Clément's stab wound. No mention was made of the aberrations found within his internal organs, the impossible creatures in his stomach, or the crystalline state of his brain. The strange objects were removed and hidden in a lead-lined box that Dr. Riolan personally buried in a secret location in the gardens of St. Cloud Castle, swearing never to reveal its whereabouts. But the silence came at a high cost to the 3 men who had witnessed the truth about the last Valois king's death. Dr. Peter Morel developed a morbid obsession with alchemy and the occult, spending his final years attempting to recreate the substances he had seen in the royal body. He died 2 years later under mysterious circumstances, found in his private laboratory with his own body transformed into a crystalline substance similar to that of Henry's brain. Anthony Dubois abandoned medicine entirely, became a monk, and spent the rest of his life in a remote monastery, flagellating himself daily and whispering prayers against demonic temptations. When he died 20 years later, his final words were, "The creatures, they are still there, still hungry." Dr. John Riolan survived longer than his colleagues, but paid a steep price for his medical curiosity. He developed a severe phobia of food, able to eat only white bread and holy water, always crossing himself over each bite before putting it in his mouth. His nights were tormented by nightmares in which he saw Henry III alive again, inviting him to a banquet where the dishes served were the creatures they had found in the royal stomach. On his deathbed in 1606, Riolan summoned a priest and confessed everything he had seen on that fateful night. His words, recorded by the priest in a document that remained sealed in the Vatican archives for centuries, included this terrifying passage: "What we found in the king's body was not the result of common disease or poisoning. It was the consequence of pacts that must not be named, of hungers that must not be sated, of knowledge that must not be sought by the children of Adam." The mysterious figure of Matteo Barberini was never found after disappearing on the night of Henry III's assassination. Some say he returned to Italy, others claim he died fleeing France. But unconfirmed reports suggest a man matching his description was seen in various European courts in subsequent years, always serving as cook to nobles who later developed bizarre appetites and died under strange circumstances. In 1598, an Italian with a similar appearance appeared in the court of Emperor Rudolph II in Prague, a monarch known for his alchemical and occult obsessions. In 1603, there were reports of a mysterious Italian cook at the court of James III of England. In 1612, ecclesiastical authorities in Rome investigated claims of a man preparing supernatural meals for corrupt cardinals in the Vatican's cellars. France, deprived of its king by the axes of religious fanaticism, plunged into a succession crisis that nearly destroyed the kingdom. Henry of Navarre, who would become Henry IV, assumed the throne after converting to Catholicism in a pragmatic political decision that scandalized both Protestant and extreme Catholic factions. But the early years of his reign were marked by an obsessive paranoia about food. Henry IV employed up to 12 official tasters, changed cooks monthly, and often fasted for days when suspicions of poisoning arose in his mind. He ordered the secret chambers where his predecessor had consumed his macabre meals, sealed permanently, and commanded that all the previous regime's culinary utensils be destroyed and buried on consecrated ground. Rumors about the real circumstances of Henry III's death persisted at the French court, like venomous whispers passed down through generations. Some versions spoke of demonic pacts, others of alchemical experiments gone awry. The most persistent, and perhaps closest to the truth, suggested that the last Valois had attempted to achieve immortality by consuming supernatural substances and creatures, only to discover that some prices are too high even for kings. During Louis XIII's reign, a secret investigation was ordered to locate and destroy any physical evidence of Henry III's profane culinary experiments. But nothing was found except some fragments of burned parchments and stains on the stone floor that resisted any cleaning attempts. In the 18th century, during preparations for the French Revolution, some radical revolutionaries attempted to use the rumors about Henry III as propaganda against the monarchy, portraying him as the ultimate example of aristocratic decadence. Clandestine pamphlets circulated through Paris with grotesque illustrations of the demon king devouring peasant children at satanic banquets. But these popular representations, no matter how horrific, did not come close to the reality, what the three physicians had discovered during that secret autopsy of 1589. The truth about Henry III remained buried, along with the three men who had witnessed it, but echoes of his story continued to reverberate through the centuries in subtle and disturbing ways. During the terror of the French Revolution, Robespierre developed an obsessive aversion to elaborate meals. Eating only simple dishes, he prepared himself. Napoleon, for his part, employed a battalion of cooks who rotated shifts, never allowing the same person to prepare his meals twice in a row. Even in the 19th century, famous chefs of French haute cuisine avoided certain ingredients and combinations without being able to explain why, as if an ancestral knowledge warned them against culinary experiments that could awaken hungers that should never exist. In 1889, exactly 300 years after Henry III's death, a series of strange deaths occurred among historians researching the French royal archives. Three scholars working independently on documents from the Valois period died under similar circumstances. All were found in their private offices, surrounded by piles of ancient documents, with expressions of absolute horror etched on their faces and a dark, viscous substance streaming from their mouths. Authorities attributed the deaths to accidental poisoning by fungi infesting the old parchments. But close colleagues reported that the three historians had mentioned extraordinary and disturbing discoveries about Henry III's reign in the weeks before their deaths. The mystery deepened when the documents those three historians were studying disappeared mysteriously from the National Archives. An official investigation concluded they had been destroyed in an accidental fire, but archive staff whispered that the parchments had simply disintegrated when exposed to light, as if made of a substance that should not exist in the normal physical world. Since then, certain sections of the French Royal Archives have remained officially inaccessible for research. for reasons never publicly explained. During World War I, French soldiers fighting in the trenches at Verdun reported strange sightings during the most intense nights of battle. Some swore they saw a royal figure in 16th century robes walking among the dead on the battlefield, apparently immune to bullets and artillery, collecting items from the fallen, perhaps organs, perhaps only their last gasps. These visions were officially attributed to the stress of war and exposure to poisonous gases, but the accounts were too consistent to be easily dismissed. The soldiers who reported these sightings often developed a profound aversion to military rations, preferring to starve rather than eat anything that might have been touched by supernatural hands, as if some primal instinct warned them of the danger of ingesting anything associated with the king's dark legacy. In the 1920s, a young chef named Auguste Beaumont stumbled upon a handwritten recipe hidden in the walls of an old castle that had been converted into a restaurant. The recipe, written in elaborate 16th century script, described a dish called l'essence de l'éternité, the essence of eternity. The listed ingredients included common spices mixed with substances Beaumont could not identify, and the preparation instructions involved rituals more akin to occult ceremonies than culinary techniques. Intrigued, the chef tried to recreate the dish, but on the first attempt, 3 of his assistants were hospitalized with symptoms doctors could not diagnose. Beaumont burned the recipe immediately and never spoke of the incident again. But he died 2 years later under mysterious circumstances, found in his private kitchen in a position that suggested he had been eating something when death overtook him. During World War II, when the Nazis occupied Paris, SS officers interested in the occult and supernatural artifacts conducted a systematic search for anything related to Henry III's royal experiments. They excavated extensively in the gardens of Saint-Cloud Castle, apparently searching for the lead box Dr. Riolan had buried centuries earlier. If they found anything, records were destroyed during the liberation of Paris, but members of the French resistance later reported that some German soldiers involved in the dig developed bizarre behaviors, refusing to eat anything other than bread and water and muttering constantly about hungry creatures waiting in the shadows. Dr. John Riolan died, carrying with him the complete secret of what he found in Henry III's stomach, but his last words, whispered to the priest administering his last rites, remained etched in the cleric's memory. The creature, it was still alive when we found it. It was still alive, and its eyes knew that we knew. The priest, a man of strong faith and steady nerves, never again celebrated the Eucharist without his hands trembling as he lifted the chalice, as if the very act of sacramental transformation reminded him of other, darker transformations that might still be occurring in places where divine light never reaches. And so, the story of Henry III endures as a grim warning about hungers that transcend the merely physical, about appetites that once awakened consume not only the body but the very soul of those foolish enough to indulge them. In the shadows of history, among the whispers that have echoed through corridors of power for centuries, the lesson persists. Some banquets exact a price higher than anyone can pay, and some recipes once tasted forever transform those foolish enough to seek them out. The last of the Valois discovered this too late, and perhaps somewhere beyond the veil of death, he is still paying the price for his insatiable hunger.